Hello, hello, and welcome back to the Where Does It Come From podcast. This time I'm going to be talking with John Taylor all about green energy and all things energy and ethical and super environmentally friendly. That's probably going to get edited for a start. This time I'm chatting with John Taylor of all things green energy and environmentally friendly energy and how we can basically make the way that we live our lives and power our lives much better for the planet. So thank you, John, for coming along. Welcome.
No, nice to be here. Thank you.
My pleasure. So firstly, I know that you're a keen environmentalist. We've known each other for years, but especially when it comes to green energy. So can you please tell us all about what triggered your interest and how that has turned into your current role?
Okay, yeah, sure. So my current role, I'm working in a team that's advising local authorities across the southeast of England on how to invest and build out local energy projects and decarbonise through renewable energy. But what started me on this path was probably first became aware of this kind of energy climate challenge back at university, kind of around 2003, 2004 time. There were two factors, I suppose. One was there were fuel protests at the time. I think fuel prices suddenly went up to £1 a litre, which is something we're well used to these days. But that's the first time it happened, and there were people blockading fuel refineries, and it kind of just highlighted just how reliant as a society we were on kind of oil and fossil fuels to function. And then, also became aware of the environmental side as well. I remember a lecturer showing us a chart of how you can tell the course of human history by drilling in an ice core and seeing the pollutants and gases that are in there. So I remember seeing this graph of, I think, both lead emissions and carbon emissions, and how you can say this is where the Roman Empire started and then dropped off, and then then World War I and World War II, and then right through to the kind of end of the 20th century, where we really started growing a global economy based on fossil fuels. And it's all there in this kind of really remote location, and that's where the kind of penny drop, where kind of the choices we make and the way we live our lives has that kind of, we're all connected back into this feedback loop of the planet's ecosystem. So that's where it all started.
That's really interesting, actually, when you think about it, because like you say, it's clear evidence, pictorial evidence of the effects that we've had, and presumably with the growth in carbon over the last century, carbon emissions, that must be having such a telling impact on the ice core, mustn't it?
Yeah, and it's all captured there, as a kind of recording. And so that kind of left me wondering, okay, this is something I'd really like to spend more time on, and kind of come up with solutions to, really. So I then followed up with a course all about renewable energy and architecture, which is I studied out at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Snowdonia. They ran some master's postgrad courses there. So I started learning about green energy in buildings, insulation, renewables like wind power and solar power. They were very interested in hydropower, being in Snowdonia, but here in East Anglia we don't quite have the same gravity or wetness and rainfall. So, but yeah, it's all useful stuff. And then around that time, I also got a job working with Ipswich Borough Council as in their climate and energy team as an advisor. And then, and that was probably 12, 13 years ago, and I've been in that kind of role as a kind of public sector climate change and energy advisor, starting off in Ipswich, growing to Suffolk, and then now advising all local authorities in the southeast of England.
Wonderful. They're wonderful. I know we first met when we were on a panel, and that must be, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. And I was talking about fashion and you were talking about energy. And then we bumped into each other again, I think, when you were involved in the Sunrise Solar project, weren't you?
Yeah, so that was a kind of social enterprise angle to all this. And that's something I'm really interested in personally. That's the big advantage of renewable energy, is it can happen at any scale. And it doesn't have to be a massive power station funded by big banks and corporations. It is really accessible to communities as well. So it could be putting solar panels on community centres and schools or business parks and even your own homes. And there's quite a big movement in the UK of people coming together and forming like village or town scale energy co-ops and co-investing in renewable energy projects together.
Mm.
So that, yeah.
It's a wonderful thing. And I think if we've learned anything from the IPCC report last week, it's about how we're going to have to change the way that we think about things like energy and come together as communities to solve some of the issues that are there. So having community energy projects, it just makes an awful lot of sense, doesn't it? So that's absolutely fascinating. So you've basically been driven by a interest and a desire for green energy since university, and you've followed up with that, and you're now in quite a a responsible role advising people on how we can make change. I mean, it's a brilliant time to be in that situation, actually, when you think about it. So yeah, I referred to the IPCC report from last week. So it's basically claimed that humanity has caused unprecedented global warming, and that we need to make large scale reductions in greenhouse gases, or we won't be able to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees as we wanted. Obviously, that's not news to you in your background, but what changes do you believe are required in how we source and use our energy, both as individuals and as organisations?
Well, I'd say the simplest message from the IPCC report and the UK government's net zero targets is that we have to stop using fossil fuels, full stop. It's like previously we had like 60% reduction or 80%, but that kind of left everyone thinking that, well, okay, I can be that 20% that remains using fossil fuels, whereas this kind of makes it clear there's not even room for that. Everybody has to kind of come up with a way of powering their businesses and homes with renewables. And so that's really what the clear message is yeah, everything we use for kind of coal, oil, petrol, diesel, gas, we have to find ways of doing the same things with it, all the things we expect energy to do for us, but yeah, with other means that don't emit carbon emissions, which is entirely possible. And from an engineering point of view, I would say.
Yeah, but also reduction, I would have thought, because we've probably been quite wasteful in the way that we use. Maybe people might not agree with that, but I think that we are quite wasteful in how we use our energy, because it's the value is perceived as we've got used to a certain way of using energy anyway, and something you and I were talking about before with older properties and things like that. There are ways we can use insulation and other things to cut down on the amount of energy that we use, as well as source from renewables.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Is definitely using less energy, or removing the waste from the energy system is equally important. Like, a lot of the infrastructure and the homes we live with weren't designed with this in mind. So I think homes designed in the Victorian age, heated with coal fires, and I think also more recently UK has had quite abundant like North Sea oil and gas available to it, so it's been relatively cheap, and compared to some other countries that didn't have that energy resource, like even colder places than us, like Scandinavia, they're far more energy efficient in their buildings, and there's a lot we can learn from other countries.
Definitely. I mean, for me, because obviously from a clothing and textiles background, I see a lot of similarities, actually. So there's doing it better, and there's reducing our need all at the same time, isn't it? So it's kind of quality and not too much volume. So it's very similar. I see great similarities there. So it's actually, I think that's a clear point that you raised there, that maybe certainly hasn't been shared in the press very widely, that we have to stop using fossil fuels. It's not a question of reducing anymore. We have to actually stop. And maybe they're scared that will frighten people, but actually, as you say, scientifically, there's no reason why we can't move across to renewables for our lives. So what would you suggest were the sort of first steps that people need to be thinking about?
Just say, like, fossil fuels have been great for getting to us to this point of kind of awareness and kind of but we need to kind of know that it's the energy that fossil fuels give us is what we value, rather than the fossil fuels themselves. So I would say we need to be thinking in terms of the things that can have the biggest impact soonest in terms of carbon reduction. I think when we talk about 2050, that kind of gives people the impression that we can plan this in a sensible kind of mannered, kind of thought out way. We'll do a few small things just to get used to it and then build up to the bigger things. But actually, the trajectory we take to 2050 really matters. And actually, the trajectory, like if you think of where our kind of society's carbon emissions are now to where they need to be in 2050, if you draw a straight line, that is kind of pushing us more towards 2 degrees of warming. And if we want to really limit it to 1.5 degrees, we need to do the biggest savings sooner. So it's the interim actions as well. Or I suppose the way I think about it is, there's a finite amount of carbon emissions I could personally emit as a personal carbon budget. And the way I currently lived say for example, currently the way we live our lives, that would all be burnt through by like 2028. So I think the first thing we need to do is measure how we use energy and the kind of associated carbon emissions as a first step. So use an online carbon calculator tool to show you where you're, as a business or your personal life, you're using energy. Then that will tell you where you can have the biggest impact soonest. So it could show up your vehicle, your car, or it could show up your home heating system, or or the way you travel, like on holiday, that sort of thing. And then you can then start making changes. So I had a look at this for my own house. The biggest thing I've probably done is I switched from a petrol car to an electric car. And then, the savings that made was like 80% of the relative carbon footprint between the two.
That's good.
And like
That's really interesting.
yeah. So that personal carbon budget with that change now lasts into the 2030s, which is better.
Yeah.
I then invested in some solar panels on the roof, which then reduced the electricity use. And I've also invested in a community wind farm as well to kind of cover some of the electric I use in my car. And then you add that carbon saving, and suddenly the carbon budget for my lifestyle reaches into the 2040s. And then so on, looking at the central heating system, if I change from a gas boiler to something like an air source heat pump, again, that would then be close to 80 to 100% saving on that carbon element of the carbon footprint. And suddenly my carbon budget stretches well into like near the end of the century. So we're getting into the realms of quite a nice lifestyle still, but ones that's more compatible with a kind of net zero target.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And it's a nice way of thinking about it in terms of a timeline and how different savings affect you, rather than it being something nebulous that you don't really know what savings you're having. You're just kind of doing your best. Yeah, I'm surprised about that the car would be so big, actually. That excuse me, I'm surprised that the car would be such a big saving, actually. You know, for me, I would have thought, thinking about my home, I've got husband, 2 teenage boys. It tends to be hot water.
Yeah.
There's a lot of showers going on here, but yeah, and not so much on the transport side. But yeah, it's so looking at the boiler, as I was talking to you before, and we use good energy for our electricity, so it's trying to switch over to electricity rather than using gas and things like that. But it's like you say, what tools would you suggest that people look at to measure their carbon footprints?
There's one really good one done by the World Wildlife Fund, WWF. I can send you a link to
I'll put a link
in the
on
notes
the
underneath.
thing,
That's a really good one. And there's a few good business tools as well, which we can make sure are linked as well. I'd have to think about that one, but there's definitely good resources out there.
Yeah, no, exactly. I know we've done it for Where Does It Come From? We've done the carbon footprint for that, but I think, as you say, having it for your home and your own life is a really good way of understanding the impact that you're having. You know, and even if it's as simple as walking to the train station every day rather than driving and things like that, it will make a difference to your carbon budget. So that's really interesting, John. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a good step that everyone can make, is actually look up their own impact, and then obviously as a business do the same thing. So changing over some of the things we're talking about, electric vehicles, heat pumps, solar panels, or those kind of things, what do you think needs to happen in our current infrastructure to allow this to happen? And I guess our economic model as well, to encourage people down these paths. What would you like to see? What do you advise organizations to do?
Yeah, I think the kind of key things are we need to find ways of generating more renewable electricity, and we need to make it easy and simple for people to invest in these solutions. I think, I think more of a kind of, I think that education is still a big part of it, just letting people know what's possible. I think a lot of the communication around climate change sometimes focuses on how bad things can be if we don't act, we get stuck on that. And I think telling more stories about how good life could be if we do solve this, and um, telling people more about the solutions and giving people a say in how we redesign the way we live, I think that's all going to be important. Because there will be some changes, like say, if we need more large solar farms and big energy projects, like where we are, there's a lot of agricultural land. There's lots of offshore wind farms that need to be connected to the grid. There will be some big infrastructure changes that some people might think is not that desirable, but they're all going to be needed if the country's going to go down this path. So that's where again the community energy angle comes in, engaging people as partners and developers in these solutions, not just having it imposed on people, is really important, I think.
And also, as you say, talking about the benefits. I mean, if you've got alternative energy, you're going to have much cleaner air.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a better place for you to live than especially in the cities. So there are a lot of benefits to moving over to renewable as well. Are there any more kind of futuristic things that people may not know about that could be coming along in terms of renewables or alternative energy sources?
Let me see. Like the heating systems are interesting, and they're going to be quite novel and new to the UK, at least, in the heat pumps. And I think there's a lot of excitement on the techie end from electric cars and like the Tesla effect. And I've seen, that's really kind of going to only increase, I think, people's excitement around that. And interesting, there's a lot of talk about hydrogen production at the moment. That's a kind of quite a new area of development. And again, something that could happen close to where we are. And there's two routes for that. One is using electricity to crack water into hydrogen and oxygen. And then you can use that hydrogen as a replacement for diesel in buses and other industrial processes. A company yesterday in Sweden just made the first batch of steel without using any coal.
Oh, brilliant.
So like completely zero carbon renewable energy powered steel, which is a really big advancement.
I remember my chemistry experiments at school, though. Doesn't hydrogen explode if it gets...
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, like everyone thinks of the Hindenburg and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm sure like we have natural gas pipes into our homes. That's equally as flammable. We have petrol in our everything has a risk to it. But and so there's a lot of interest in hydrogen at the moment. We have a lot of offshore wind in the UK that could be a source for that. I think certainly in the Middle East, that's something, and places like Australia, that's something where they're really going to pivot to away from coal and oil. That's really the kind of sci-fi stuff. Is you're going to suddenly see massive solar arrays in the deserts and Saudi Arabia and places like that, and they're going to start synthesizing hydrogen from solar power and then exporting that instead of oil. And I think that's going to be a really interesting thing that comes along in the near future.
Yeah, no, definitely. And of course, there's always the debate about nuclear, isn't there? So I was on a Green Party thing the other day, and there was lots of people talking about we can't have nuclear, it's dangerous, and people trying to explain no, nuclear energy is clean energy. It's very different from bombs, I guess, when it comes down to it. But there's a fear of it, I think.
Yeah. And I think for the climate argument, there's certainly a case to be made for extending the life of existing nuclear power stations as much as possible. Like we saw with Germany, they prematurely closed a lot of nuclear power plants and they filled that back in with coal power, which from a climate point of view isn't fantastic.
No, definitely not.
But yeah, there's not necessarily easy answers for the electricity side. Like if you don't want to use nuclear power, you then have to find an equal amount of energy from another source, which would mean more wind turbines and more solar farms primarily. So yeah, at some point people have to say yes to something in terms of living with technology.
Yeah, and again, it's last episode of the podcast we talked to Rebecca about electric vehicles, and there's a lot of comparisons there about behaviour change and understanding about how we need to change, but also the benefits of moving over to an electric vehicle. And she was explaining how much the last, say, 20 years research has been put into different technologies, whereas say battery technology had been dormant for quite a long time, whereas now there's so much research going into battery technology. And I guess that's the same. It sort of lines up nicely with energy as well, because obviously if we're getting all this solar energy from the desert or wherever we want to get it from community, then if we can store that efficiently and share it around the country, around the world, then that's going to be a fantastic advance, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, if you think, another techie solution is, if you think about electric cars, they're effectively batteries on wheels. And if you can have a two-way charging plug, you can come up with a scenario where if you've got a battery full of electricity in your driveway, you can actually plug it back into your house and then run your house off your car. And then and that adds a lot more flexibility into the energy system as well, and allow people to charge up when it's cheap and the wind's blowing hard. And then if you've got a cold, dark, windless night, you can then have some power to use that way.
Oh, that is nice. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of interesting scenarios, isn't there, around how it can work. But I think it's like you say, it's about the education. It's about people are, understandably, people have very busy lives, and the idea of changing and moving it can be quite a frightening thing if you're used to being in a particular way and change has been a gradual thing. Then to suddenly be told that you need to change can be, can give you a bit of fear. But really, it's pointing out the positives, as you say, and the exciting sides of some of the new technologies and opportunities that will come from that. So yeah, it's all a very positive thing. In terms of economic model, though, do you think that there needs to be changes to our economic legal systems to allow some of this to happen? Are there things holding us back from making these changes now?
Well, yeah, it's still, like, we are still set up the way before, and the challenges we see when we're working on projects is fossil fuels for heating, for example, are still too cheap, and the value people can get from selling power at the moment is still relatively small, and that's certainly something that needs to be rectified, or kind of rebalanced at least. At the moment, for electricity, like for running heat pumps and cars, about 25% of the cost of a power is actually like social and environmental taxes, which aren't levied on fossil fuels like oil and gas.
Okay.
So it's actually kind of a disincentive to use those at the moment. Whereas if that was removed and kind of either put onto the fossil fuel sources or general taxation, that would then make it a lot easier to run on electricity.
Yeah, I mean, people are always going to be incentivized by price. That's just the way that at the moment our sort of economy works. You switch your energy provider to provide the cheapest deal, and all of that. It's like if you're flying, people will fly with the cheapest plane. But
yeah, and I think that's the other thing that's going to evolve as well, is that kind of offer to households in terms of cars. Well, people already start to lease their cars a lot, and that's what we need to get people thinking about more, is not necessarily the upfront investment or cost, but what's it going to cost you per month, like to either lease a car or like with a heat pump. If you then break down all the upfront investment you need to do your, like, change the radiators in your house or fit insulation and fit a heat pump, if you then were able to spread the cost of that, like through a green mortgage, or they call it as a heat as a service package as well, where some other company invests in all that upfront on your behalf, and then you kind of pay a monthly service charge. Actually, when you break it down, the monthly cost is very similar to what you currently probably pay on petrol or gas. At the moment, we kind of used to paying, like, cars are relatively cheap, boilers are relatively cheap, but then you pay through the fuel. So it's kind of breaking down the offers to people, and to show that it's actually not that different from what you currently pay probably on a whole cost basis.
Definitely. That's so true. And I think, with electric vehicles as well, coming out last week was the maintenance of an electric vehicle compared with the maintenance of a petrol or diesel car is so low, compared. So if you add up all the costs of something over 3 or 5 years, then, you're going to find that it's going to balance out quite nicely. And if the government or other organizations are going to help people with that, then there's more of an incentive to go ahead with it. But first, there has to be that education piece, and there has to be that willingness, I guess, from the government to encourage people towards those changes, because at the moment, as you say, then they're not. I mean, the one not related, but it seems to me very similar. When you're looking to travel, when we were allowed to travel abroad, you look at the cost of a flight as opposed to catching the train, and it's 2 or 3 times more to catch the train. So of course people don't catch the train. And then the argument is, well, people don't want to catch the train because they prefer to fly, but that's because flying is so subsidized as opposed to train travel. So I don't think people generally understand that we are being coerced, we're being pushed to certain behaviors based on an economic model, which currently make no sense with where the direction, the targets that we're trying to get to, the government say they're trying to get to for all of us, for the world, for the planet. So it's how do we make those changes? How do we communicate those with people? I don't know. Do you have any ideas?
That kind of flying one just reminded me of something called as a policy idea called a frequent flyer levy, where it's still a relatively affluent thing to do. The majority of flights are taken by middle class, wealthier people. So there is an idea that you start off the first flight people are allowed to take as a relatively kind of low taxed thing, but the more flights people take in a year, then the larger the tax ramps up on it. So they call it a frequent flyer levy. So the more someone flies, the more revenues generated to then subsidize those alternatives like train travel and things like that. But like I said, there are lots of people thinking around the ways to do this in a just, fair way. And I don't know, there's last year the Parliament ran something called the UK Climate Assembly, which was a really interesting exercise, in that they selected about 100 random representative citizens, ordinary people from around the UK that haven't been looking like I have on climate and energy stuff, but they've just been getting on with their lives. And they gave them kind of a intensive kind of like overview of climate and energy challenges, and then set them a series of scenarios and policy options of what we can do about it, and kind of to get their feedback on what people would accept and in terms of changes to their lifestyles and all that. And they actually found once people had it explained to them, people were willing to be quite radical, more ambitious than the kind of policy analysts expected. So I think, that's where, and there's a documentary about the whole process on BBC iPlayer called "The People versus Climate Change." I think, really relatable kind of stories and engagement with people like that is really good.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually, and that made me think a lot of sort of the last year or so of our existence with the whole coronavirus and behaviour change thing, and how when people understand the goals, when people understand the reasons for changing the way that they live, people will do it, because we are a community, and the majority of people want to live as a community and help other people and wear masks to protect other people and all of that, once they understand why it's important.
And I think people underestimate how willing and bought into all this their neighbours and people around them are as well. And I think it's really important that it is sometimes presented as a really big, overwhelming challenge, which I think it makes it difficult for them people to make that connect between their personal lives and how it's going to have an impact. And I've seen also a lot of people saying, okay, well, what about the UK? It's all China and India and America and all that. But it's really the way we frame and tell the story of climate change really impacts how people think of it and react to it. And like a common analogy I hear politicians use, it's like an oil tanker where we have to try and turn the ship around, which kind of gets across the immensity of the challenge, but then everyone sitting in the ship kind of not really in control of it. So it kind of, how is me changing my light bulbs or changing my car going to contribute? Whereas I think there's another way of describing it which is far more empowering, and that's not as an oil tanker but as like a murmuration of starlings. So it, like the big flock of birds whirling around, and it looks like something big, but you look and it's actually composed of all those millions of individuals kind of acting as a flock together. And it's suddenly an agile thing. It can actually turn really quickly, and that starts with individuals kind of changing direction, and that influences the people around them, and that movement can ripple through the whole flock. And
Definitely.
that's where all our choices add up to that big emergent effect of climate change, I would argue.
I think of herring when you talk about the starlings.
Yeah.
I think of herring. You see these wonderful wildlife documentaries of these herring, and they just move so quickly when there's a noise or something triggers a response in them. But yes, you're right. I think the oil tanker gives us that feeling of lack of control, doesn't it? Whereas in fact we can all do something. And one thing we can all do is, if we don't like the way that things are being managed, is we can write to our representatives, our councillors and our MPs, and we can say, well, hang on, we know that we want to reduce our carbon emissions, and this particular policy or this subsidy is making this not work. You need to do something about it. And I think there's a general feeling that that won't make any difference, but actually the more people that do it, the more difference it's going to make. And we ultimately have the power to change the government if we're not happy with the way it is. I mean, it may not be, the system may not be perfect, but at least we have that vehicle that we can use to change the government, or to speak to our local councillors and get things changed within our local area. So we do have power. We're not on an oil tanker. We're a starling or a herring or something like that.
Yeah,
We
I think
are a
that
herring.
feedback's really important, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of gone into what this area already, but my next question was, what other wide changes do you think need to happen so that we can actually meet the targets set out by, say, the Paris Agreement? We can try and get to our keep at less than 1.5 degrees increase, and all the other emissions targets.
Yeah, so yeah, we kind of covered the fossil fuel side of things there, and there are other elements to the kind of what's happening. Yeah, there's the whole emissions from agriculture and fertilizer and the way we use land. That's going to be a really a big contributor to the whole process as well. So yeah, that is underpinned by energy to some point, in that it's about how we produce fertilizers and fuel tractors, and yeah, but there's also things like diet and the sorts of crops we plant, and yeah, there's really interesting kind of farming systems being developed that integrate a lot more trees into the landscape, like agroforestry. Some really interesting projects. There's one up in Suffolk called Wakelands Agroforestry, which is a really nice example of how you can do that. Yeah, and again, there's the whole, it's like climate change is ultimately about the carbon cycle. It's about what goes up into the air, but also what comes down again. So that land use is almost, and the reforestry side of things is equally important in terms of enhancing the landscape's ability to draw down and sequester carbon. And then what we do with trees, and it applies to the seas as well as equally as the land. I think down in Sussex they're looking at rebuilding the kelp forests that used to exist off the coast there, because those kind of estuaries, tidal kind of coastal environments are really good at seaweed at sucking down carbon as well as trees. So
it's using nature, well, not using nature, being in harmony with nature.
Exactly, it's that balance that is really important. And
it is. It really is. No, that's very interesting. And you reminded me of something I read the other day about more artificial carbon sequestering plans that have been mooted, about burying some of this carbon deep down in the rocks, which makes me go, no, that doesn't sound like a good idea. I don't know what you think.
I think, that's something we do have to start thinking about, is they call it geological carbon sequestration, because that's ultimately where a lot of the fossil fuels have come from. It's come from underground, and before they weren't active as part of the carbon cycle, but now they are up in the air. And so yeah, we do have the ability to enhance trees, get more carbon into the soil and that sort of thing. But we've seen with all the wildfires recently, there is a risk to that, that in a world with some climate change already built in, that carbon is vulnerable to then being released through wildfires. So if that permanent geological sequestration is going to be really important going forward as well. Yeah, and I think there's a few kind of routes to do that. Yeah, one is you creating charcoal effectively. So you get trees and then you turn the living you turn the wood into charcoal, maybe get some energy recovery at the same time, and then you can bury the charcoal underground or into the soil. But yeah, there's also these quite futuristic companies that are starting to just basically suck carbon dioxide out of the air with giant fans.
That's what I was reading
Yeah,
about.
because there's one in Iceland, I think, where they're doing that with powered by geothermal energy, and then they're pumping the liquid carbon dioxide down into the earth, into the rock formation, where it will then turn back into solid stone. So yeah, there's lots of startups looking at that part of it as well, and like the IPCC and the government kind of say that will need to be part of our carbon plans by the end of the century to kind of start getting that balance of carbon back out of the atmosphere into other parts of the carbon cycle.
It's a short-term win, isn't it? But I suppose it's for me, I just think, I don't know, I'd rather see it done slowly and naturally, but I guess we just don't have the time to do it. We need to be coming up with some of these more what would you call it, ambitious things that may solve some of the problems in the shorter term, while we can get our house in order for the longer term. But it's it's definitely something we have to look at, all of the things. I mean, I saw a very interesting slide the other day with all of the different energy sources, and it's going to be a combination. There's not one size that fits all, is there? There's basically lots of different things that we need to be looking at and investing in all of them, and then using all of them in different ways to provide a balance of how we source our energy. So we're not too reliant on just the one or two different ways of doing things.
And there's lots of, if people want to find out more, there's lots of good information out there, and there's, like in the UK, we have the Climate Change Committee that is kind of an independent panel of experts that look at the options for the UK as a whole. And then in America, there's something called Project Drawdown, who are a charity that kind of list all the solutions available to us. People can go and explore that on the,
not put them on. Everyone can do some light reading on all of this. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. So just coming near to the end now, I was going to say, could you suggest maybe three small things that people could do? Actually, I'll change that phrase. Could you suggest 3 things that people can do right now in their lives that will actually help us move to a more green energy world?
Okay. I would say one thing that's often commonly put out there as an easy thing to do is to switch your energy tariff, which, like, from wherever you are at the moment to one that's 100% backed by renewable energy. I would say go beyond that slightly and find one that's actually, try and invest in a renewable energy project directly. There's either through a community energy group, or there's a company called Ripple Energy that builds wind farms, and you can buy a share in it and have the power it generates linked back to your energy bill. That's one thing I would say.
I like that.
If you're a business, I think, try and work out what you're reliant on in terms of carbon and fossil at the moment, and try and design your products or processes in a way that isn't. I suppose that's more of a general one, but
that's a good one.
But I would say, the big, like, people focus on the big things that you're gonna do it once, make a big decision once. So, like, sometimes people get caught up on the daily choices we have to make in terms of what we buy every day, but it's the big decisions that matter. Like your heating system, you change it once and it might be that way for 15 years. So doing that right the first time is going to be a big one to focus on, I would say.
Definitely.
And then I would actually say try and get a job doing this. This isn't something ultimately we can do in our spare time as volunteers. The more people we have making climate action and energy their day job, is how we're going to solve this really. And try and that's
Big change.
a big thing as well. But
Yeah, no, interesting about you talking about energy tariffs as well, because I was reading something this morning about there's going to be an investigation, isn't there? Because a lot of the companies that say that they have green tariffs, it's actually, when you look into it, probably a fair bit of greenwashing going on there. And there's it's actually, if you just want to change your energy tariff, look at someone who is working directly with the energy providers. So Good Energy, I think it's Ecotricity, some of those other ones that actually work directly. And some of the major names we know, they're doing it in an indirect way and just buying certificates, and it's not necessarily as what general public think that it actually is. So that's just a bit of a warning I read this morning, which makes a lot of sense.
But definitely that's an issue to be aware of. So to summarize, I'd say the three things to invest in a renewable energy project linked to your energy tariff, perhaps. Check where your pension and banks and investments are held as well, because that's like your pensions being used to then fund fossil fuel projects. That kind of undermines the point of a pension in some way, in terms of giving you a secure future. That there's lots of companies offering ethical investments. Some will even invest in renewable energy projects in developing countries. It's a really good scheme called Energize Africa that's worth a look, like a crowdfunding platform. And then it comes down to your heating your vehicle, measure your carbon footprint, and then get some personal advice from those about where's best to focus on in your own situation.
I think your earlier comment about measuring your own carbon footprint is a really good one. If you can actually see what small changes that you're making every day, or big changes, but the effect of how much of a carbon budget that gives you personally, and by doing that, there's a ripple of change there out into the community, because other people are going to be doing the same thing, and it's going to be making a big difference. So that's a really good way of doing it. I loved your point as well about, if you like this kind of stuff, go and work in it, because the way I see it, I think there's going to be a lot of big changes. There's going to be lots of new jobs. There's going to be, if we're actually going to seriously attempt to and succeed in reducing our carbon emissions, then there's going to be a whole different variety of jobs and things coming along. And if this is something that interests people, now's the time to go out and find out about it, and maybe do a course like you were talking about, the one you did, and understand it. And it can start off with activism, can't it, and then turn into a whole career, as I think happened for you and I.
Yeah, exactly.
And a lot of the people that we know. So you start off with an interest, and then go find out more, and then that can become your life, and you're doing something you love, and you're changing the world at the same time to be a better place. So what's not to like, as they say. No, that's brilliant, John. Is there anything else you'd like to add about things you think we could be doing, or things we may not have covered in the conversation about green energy?
I think they're the main things I wanted to cover. Like, there may well be specific projects, and like I'm always happy to take questions from people as well if they want to email anything in, and have things clarified. So I just kind of want to get across to the point that it sounds scary and dire situation, but it's entirely possible for us to turn this around and actually end up with a way of life that's better than today. This isn't as good as it gets. I keep saying it. There's a future can be better if we want it to be.
Definitely. No, that's it. We're setting a bar that where we are is where we want to be, but actually we want to be better, don't we?
Yeah.
We want to have cleaner air. We want to have healthier lives. We want to have a better situation. Let's not limit ourselves with today's life, and let's think about current possibilities and how fantastic that could be for future generations as well. So that's a great place to end. So thank you so much for your time, John Taylor. We'll add lots of links onto the podcast. People can link with you on LinkedIn, I guess, and contact you directly through there. So if anyone's listening, he's John Taylor on LinkedIn. If you can't find him, he's connected to me, so you should be able to find him through there. But yes, thank you so much for your time, John, and your expertise. It's been fantastic talking to you, as always.
Great. Thank you very much.